I keep telling myself I should have said something sooner. But I've lived long enough to know that timing has its own strange logic, even when it stings. My name is Catherine Marsh. I'm 64 years old, and for the past 4 years since my divorce was finalized, I've been learning slowly, painfully, how to take up space again. Sounds simple. It isn't. When you spend 3 decades making yourself smaller so someone else can feel larger, the habit becomes invisible. You stop noticing you're doing it. You just keep shrinking quietly, gracefully, until one day you look in the mirror and wonder where the woman you used to be has gone. I used to be someone who took risks. At 22, fresh out of university in Halifax with a French literature degree and absolutely no sensible plan, I bought a one-way ticket to France. My mother thought I'd lost my mind. My father said nothing, which in his particular language meant the same thing. But I went anyway because something in me needed to know what I was made of when no one was watching. I ended up in Lyon. Not Paris. Paris was for tourists and romantics. Lyon was where real French life happened, loud and messy and completely alive. I'd meant to stay 3 months, maybe 4. I stayed 8 years. I learned French the way you can only learn it when survival depends on it. Not from apps or textbooks, but from the woman at the morning market who sold me overripe plums and corrected my grammar without being asked. From the regulars at the Buchin where I waited tables my first 2 years, men in their 60s who teased me mercilessly until my Lyonnaise accent was better than passable. I didn't just learn the words. I learned the rhythm of it, the particular music of how people in that city speak, faster than Parisian French, more clipped, with its own shortcuts that no classroom would ever teach you. Then I met Daniel. He was a civil engineer from Hamilton, Ontario, in Lyon on a 6-month consulting contract. We met at a terrible gallery opening a colleague had dragged me to. He was standing in front of a painting that looked like someone had sneezed on a canvas, and he turned to me and said very quietly in English, "I genuinely have no idea what I'm looking at, and I suspect no one else does either." I laughed so hard the gallery owner glared at us. He extended his contract, then extended it again. When he finally had to go back to Canada, he asked me to come with him. I said yes. I packed up my little apartment near the View Lyon and left behind that version of myself. The one who was fluent and independent and completely at home in a city that had once been completely foreign to her. I became Catherine Marsh, wife, then mother, then suburban woman in Ontario whose biggest adventure was finding a good market on Saturday mornings. My French stayed with me, but quietly. I read French novels. Occasionally spoke to myself in the garden the way you might hum a song from another life. But I never made a point of it. It wasn't relevant anymore, or so I told myself. My daughter Sophie grew up knowing her mother had lived in France. But it was one of those vague family facts children absorb without really registering, like knowing your grandparents came from somewhere else. She never asked many questions. I never pushed it. The Lyon years started to feel like something that had happened to a different person, someone braver and freer than the woman I'd gradually become. The divorce came after 31 years. I won't say it was a surprise. Some things erode so slowly you don't notice the damage until the whole structure is already compromised. When Daniel told me he'd met someone else, the strangest part was how unsurprised I felt. Sophie was 30 by then, established as a graphic designer in Toronto. She'd been with a man for 2 years, a structural engineer named Marc Fontaine, French-Belgian on his father's side, raised in Brussels. She'd mentioned him enough that I felt I knew him in outline, though I'd only met him twice before he proposed. He was careful and quiet in his speech, genuinely kind when he looked at my daughter. That was enough for me. The engagement was in February. By May, Marc's parents had flown in from Brussels. His mother, Isabelle, and his father, Alain, were spending 2 weeks in Canada, a few days in Toronto, then a weekend at a rented cottage near Huntsville where both families would meet properly for the first time. Sophie called me 3 weeks before, excited and slightly nervous. "Mom, I really want this to go well. Isabelle is lovely, but she has high standards. They're proud people. I just want everyone to feel comfortable." I told her I would do my best. I genuinely meant it. What I didn't tell her was that I was quietly terrified, not of Isabelle or Alain, but of myself. 4 years out of a marriage, living alone in a too-quiet house in Guelph, I'd become uncertain about how I came across to people. Daniel had spent the last decade making small comments, nothing dramatic, Nothing you could name directly, just a slow, steady drip suggesting I was either too much or not quite enough depending on the occasion. You absorb that. It changes how you carry yourself without you realizing it. The cottage was beautiful, right on the water, the kind of place that feels expensive because it is. I arrived to find Mark already there and Sophie in the kitchen, flushed and happy. Isabel and Alain had arrived an hour earlier. Isabel came out to greet me as I was pulling my bag from the car. She was tall, impeccably put together even for a cottage weekend. Pressed linen trousers, a silk blouse in pale gray, silver jewelry that was understated and clearly not inexpensive. She air-kissed both my cheeks in the European manner and said warmly, technically, "Catherine, we have heard so much. Welcome." The smile was present without quite reaching her eyes. Alain shook my hand firmly, the kind of man who seemed to have strong opinions about wine and expressed them without apology. We had drinks on the deck before dinner. The light was doing something extraordinary to the lake, all copper and gold. Under other circumstances I would have found it deeply lovely. Instead, I sat slightly apart from the main group, nursing a glass of Ontario Riesling, watching the conversation move around me in that particular way it does when you're not quite part of it. Isabel and Alain spoke English well. But when they spoke to each other, or occasionally to Mark, they shifted into French without seeming to notice they'd done it. Natural thing, falling into your first language with people who share it. I understood that completely. What they didn't know was that I understood everything else too. The first exchange I caught was between Isabel and Alain while Sophie had gone inside to check on dinner, and Mark was getting more drinks. They were speaking quickly, in the comfortable shorthand of a couple who has been together a very long time. Isabel said the cottage was charming, if perhaps a bit rustic. Alain agreed, adding something about Canadians substituting nature for culture. Dismissive, not malicious. The kind of thing people say when they believe they're alone. Then Isabel glanced toward the door where Sophie had disappeared and said, still in French, "She seems sweet, Mark, Sophie. A little uncomplicated in her tastes, perhaps, but good-natured. The important thing is that she makes him happy." Mark, who had just returned, replied evenly that yes, Sophie made him very happy, and that he'd appreciate it if his mother didn't describe the woman he intended to marry as uncomplicated. Isabel waved it off. I meant it kindly. I kept my face perfectly still. At dinner, the seating arranged itself naturally so that I ended up at one end of the table with Alain, while Isabel, Mark, and Sophie clustered at the other end. The food was wonderful. Sophie had cooked bœuf bourguignon from a recipe she'd been practicing for weeks, and she'd done it beautifully. Alain complimented the meal sincerely in English, then turned to me and asked politely about my work. I told him I'd taught English at a secondary school for 22 years and had recently retired. He nodded in the way that people nod when they've decided something isn't interesting, then turned and said something to Isabel in French, low but not quite low enough. He said he understood now why the daughter was a little unpolished. The mother seemed kind enough, but not someone who had ever really seen much of the world. I set my fork down very carefully on the edge of my plate. Isabel replied that it wasn't a criticism. Plenty of people lived quiet, contained lives and were perfectly content. Not everyone had the curiosity or the courage to build something beyond the ordinary. She said it gently, the way you might observe that someone has plain taste in furniture. A verdict delivered in what she believed was a sealed room. Sophie looked up from her conversation with Mark, catching something in the quality of the silence even if she hadn't followed the words. "Everything okay down there?" "Wonderful," I said. "The wine is lovely." My hand was completely steady when I reached for my glass. I was quite proud of that. I waited until Sophie excused herself to bring out dessert and Mark followed to help. Alain was mid-sentence, something about the importance of strong cultural roots for children, when I said in French in the specific accent of someone who learned the language in Lyon and not in Brussels, but close enough that there was no mistaking it. "I think, Alain, you may be underestimating the value of roots you cannot see." The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences I have ever sat inside. Alain's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Isabel's head turned toward me slowly. I looked back at both of them with the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently and has simply decided the wait is over. After a long moment, Alain said carefully in French, "You speak French?" "I do," I said. "I lived in Lyon for 8 years. I learned the language there, not from a classroom. I apologize for not mentioning it sooner. I was curious what you actually thought of us. Isabel said, barely above a whisper. How much did you understand? Everything, I said. From the comment about the cottage to the observation about my daughter to the concern about your son spending his life carrying a wife with no cultural foundation. I paused. I want you to know I'm not angry. I understand the impulse to speak honestly in what you believe is a private language. I've done it myself in other rooms in other years. But I think there are some things that need to be said before Sophie comes back. I folded my hands on the table. My heart was hammering somewhere behind my ribs. My voice stayed level. My daughter is not uncomplicated. She is direct. There is a difference and it matters. She says what she means because she was raised to believe that honesty is a form of respect. She reads widely. She travels when she can. She has taught herself skills simply because she wanted to understand how things work. The fact that she doesn't perform sophistication the way you might be accustomed to doesn't mean it isn't there. Alan opened his mouth. I held up one hand gently. As for me, yes, I lived a quiet life for many years. I was a wife, then a mother, then a teacher, and I poured myself into those things because they were worth pouring myself into. But before all of that, I was 22 years old and I moved to France alone with almost nothing, and I built a life in Lyon that would probably surprise you. I know that city the way you know Brussels. I worked in a bouche where the French I spoke wasn't good enough, and then I made it good enough. I left because I fell in love. I stayed away because I was raising a family, and I let that chapter go quiet because it seemed like the right thing to do. I took a small sip of wine. I'm telling you this not to impress you. I'm telling you because you formed a very firm opinion about my daughter and about me based on one evening, and that opinion is incomplete. Your son loves a woman who is honest, hardworking, and genuinely kind. Those are not simple qualities. They are rare. And I would appreciate it if, going forward, you extended her the same generosity I am extending to you right now, instead of measuring her against a standard she doesn't know she's being held to. The sound of Sophie's laughter drifted in from the kitchen. Alan set down his glass. Something in his expression had shifted. The careful, appraising look he'd worn all evening had softened into something more uncertain. We have not been kind, he said quietly. Not entirely. No, I agreed. Isabel pressed both hands flat on the table. Catherine, I owe you an apology. I owe your daughter one as well. She paused. 8 years in Lyon. Really? Really? I waited tables near the presqu'île for 2 years before I got the teaching position I actually wanted. The owner told me my French was an insult to France in general. He was not generous with compliments. Something crossed Alan's face then that I hadn't expected, a genuine smile. We talked for nearly an hour after dessert. The markets, the travels, the way Lyon felt different from Paris in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. Isabel told me about Brussels, the neighborhood where Mark had grown up, the bakery that had finally closed during the pandemic. Sophie and Mark sat beside us and listened with the slightly stunned expressions of people hearing a language they'd always known their parents could speak but had never heard them use together. Later in the evening, Isabel came and sat beside me on the couch. She looked at the lake through the window for a moment before she spoke. What I said about Sophie, she said in English this time. It was unkind, and I said it in French because I told myself it was between Alan and me. But the intention doesn't change what was said. She looked at me. She is clearly a remarkable woman. I was making judgments about things I didn't understand yet. I do that when I'm nervous. It is not something I'm proud of. Thank you for saying that, I said. It means something. Luca loves her. She smiled genuinely this time. And if she has her mother's character, then we are gaining something very good. I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. Then she asked, why didn't you say something earlier? You understood everything from the beginning. You could have stopped it much sooner. I thought about that honestly. Partly because I was trying to be polite. We Canadians are perhaps too committed to that particular habit. I smiled slightly. But partly because I have spent 4 years letting things pass that I should have spoken up about. I've been so afraid of being too much, too demanding, too opinionated, too present that I became too little. And I'm tired of it. I'm 64 years old. I lived in Lyon. I raised a remarkable daughter. I survived a difficult marriage with my sense of humor reasonably intact. I think it's time I stopped apologizing for being a person. Isabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say that a woman who makes herself invisible to keep the peace has surrendered the only thing that was truly hers." Your grandmother sounds like someone I would have liked. She was formidable. She looked at the lake. You remind me a little of her, actually. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings do. Sophie made tea. Mark found a card game none of us were especially good at. We played badly for an hour while the fire burned down. At some point Sophie looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in a very long time. Something between pride and wonder. The look she used to give me when she was 8 years old, and I did something she hadn't expected. Before I drove back the next morning, Mark walked me to my car. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you said about Sophie. She didn't need defending. She would have handled it herself if she'd known what was being said. But still, your mother opened the door herself," I said. "I just knocked." He laughed, and I liked the sound of it. On the drive home, my phone lit up steadily. Sophie texting. *Mom. You have been holding out on me for 30 years. Followed by a voice memo of her attempting to say something in French, getting it almost entirely wrong. Alain sending a formal and genuinely sincere email, old-fashioned I thought and rather charming, apologizing properly, and mentioning a restaurant in Lyon he thought I'd find worthwhile if I ever went back. And then Isabel, short and direct in French. We would like you to come to Brussels before the wedding. Mark's grandmother is 92 and does not travel anymore. She should meet you. I think you would have things to say to each other. Please consider it. I read it twice, sitting in a Tim Hortons parking lot outside Barrie with a medium coffee going cold in my hand. Then I thought about the woman I'd been at 22, who had bought a one-way ticket to France with very little money and no guarantee of anything, who had learned a language in a city that had no patience for timidity, who had understood at some point in those 8 years that the only way to take up space in a place that hadn't made room for you was to take it, not aggressively but steadily, as a simple matter of being present. I had spent 4 years trying to disappear, to be gracious about my own irrelevance, to stop needing things and wanting things and taking up room that someone else might need. I was done with that. I texted Isabel back in French. I told her I would be delighted to come to Brussels, that I would very much like to meet Mark's grandmother, and that if she had recommendations for where to stay, I'd be grateful, because I hadn't been to Europe in over 30 years and I intended to do it properly. Her response came back in 3 minutes, a ranked list of hotels, each with brief and highly specific notes. I laughed out loud in that parking lot, startling a man walking past with a box of Timbits. I sat there another minute looking at the lake, thinking about Lyon, about the market on Rue Auguste Comte, about the bouchon owner who had told me my French was an insult to France and then, 2 years later, without any fanfare at all, had started introducing me to customers as someone worth talking to, about the woman I had been before I learned to be small. She hadn't gone anywhere, it turned out. She'd just been waiting patiently for me to stop pretending she was gone. I finished my coffee, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove home. I had a passport to renew, a suitcase to find, and a daughter who wanted her mother to teach her how to order food in French before the wedding, which gave me approximately 8 months to accomplish something I suspected would require significant patience on both our parts. I was already looking forward to it. I should have spoken up sooner. I know that. But I've come to believe that sooner wasn't something I was ready for yet. I needed to lose my way for a while before I could understand what I'd been walking away from. I needed 4 years of quiet and a dinner by a lake and 2 Belgian strangers who didn't know I could hear them, to finally say clearly, to myself and to anyone else who needed to know, I am still here. I have always been here. And I am not nearly as small as I made myself believe.